The murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi has reverberated around the world, which is still awaiting a credible explanation of what happened. I'll be asking what the fallout from this gruesome incident is likely to be and how far the diplomatic ripples will spread. Meanwhile, a caravan of some 7,000 would-be immigrants is marching through Central America to attempt to get into the United States to apply for political asylum. What is the likelihood that they might eventually realize their dreams, and what does President Trump have to say about that? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. The Saudi Crown Prince has come out to condemn the death of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi as a heinous crime. Khashoggi disappeared inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October the 2nd. The Saudi government initially said that he had left the consulate. Then last Friday they said that he was accidentally killed inside at the hands of Saudi government officials during a fistfight. That explanation has been met with wide skepticism, especially from Western allies of the U.S. and many U.S. lawmakers. U.S. President Donald Trump, who's been ambiguous on his stance about Khashoggi's death, accused on Monday the Saudi leadership of deception. On Tuesday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that the U.S. would revoke visas for 21 Saudi officials as a reaction to Khashoggi's death. Now, Saudi Arabia has said it will retaliate against any sanctions. Meanwhile, Gina Haspel, the FBI director, listened to audio recordings purportedly of what happened inside the consulate during a visit to Turkey. Now, how will the incident affect the U.S.-Saudi alliance, and how is the situation likely to play out? I'm joined in Shanghai by Professor Tuğrul Keskin from the Center for Turkish Studies at Shanghai University, from Jerusalem by Marcos Sheff, CEO of Impact C, and in Washington, D.C., Dr. Doa Erab from the School of International Service at the American University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, Khashoggi's death has definitely fractured U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia. This is what President Donald Trump said recently about the incident. Let's listen in first.
They had a very bad original concept. It was carried out poorly, and the cover-up was one of the worst in the history of cover-ups.
So, Dr. Erab in Washington, D.C., let me go to you first. Now, Republicans and Democrats in Congress have urged the president to consider imposing sanctions on Saudi Arabia. Now, the UK is also taking actions by revoking visas to Saudis. Is it likely that the U.S. could impose some kind of sanctions on Saudi Arabia?
Not at this point, but we should definitely expect the important talking heads at the Congress putting a little bit more pressure on the Trump administration, especially now that CIA Director Gina Haspel, she was offered to hear the recording, alleged recording of the torture and murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. When she gets back to Washington, D.C., most probably she will be asked to testify at the Congress about what she heard, and as a result there may be more pressure on the Trump administration from both sides of the aisle. So far already two important Republican senators voiced their concern about the alleged involvement of the Crown Prince in the murder, so we should expect to see increasing pressure on the Trump administration. Obviously, Donald Trump is not willing to really shake things too much at this point, but he may be willing to let go of Crown Prince if the allegations are proved to be true through the deposition of Gina Haspel if she's asked to talk at the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, well, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister said on Tuesday that the kingdom was committed to a complete investigation into Khashoggi's death. Let's listen to what he said.
I expressed the commitment of the custodian of the two holy mosques, King Salman bin Abdulaziz, and the commitment of His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to see to it that the investigation is thorough and complete, and that the truth is revealed, and that those responsible will be held to account, and that procedures and mechanisms are put in place to ensure that something like this can never happen again.
Okay, so Saudi Arabia has sent a team to Turkey for investigation, and as I said, the Saudi Crown Prince said on Wednesday distanced himself from the case, calling it a heinous crime, and insisted that Saudi Arabia and Turkey were working together to bring the perpetrators to justice. So, Professor Keskin, how do you comment on the latest twist to the Saudi explanation on this incident?
Yeah, actually, I don't think this is a coincidence that this incident happened in Istanbul, because last several years Arab oppositions was getting together in Istanbul. Istanbul is a now center of the Arab opposition, especially after the Arab Spring, and including the people from Saudi Arabia, including the people from Egypt, Syria, many different parts of the Arab world. This is the first of all that we need to understand. This will have a regional realignment and regional consequences in near future. And secondly, that we need to understand that Salman's hand is very weak now against the United States in this context. United States, remember the September 11, 15 out of 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Just right after the September 11, King Abdulaziz Al Saud was invited to United States, Texas, 6 months later basically, and he contributed to American economy almost more than $170 billion. This might create another kind of negotiation with the United States, actually, between Saudi Arabia and the United States. On the other hand, Turkish case is slightly different, that Turkey is using this case against Saudi Arabia for his own geopolitical domination.
Okay, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's still come back to the United States. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has been pushing back against public pressure to cancel weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. Trump said that he was not willing to lose lucrative business deals over the fate of someone who is just a U.S. citizen, a U.S. resident, not even a citizen. So, Marcos, how do you look at President Trump's considerations here?
Thank you, Shimel. Clearly, considerations of self-interest, frankly, like every other leader that is involved in this saga. There are massive interests that nations have with Saudi Arabia in relation to trade, in relation to arms sales, as you just said, and of course strategic relations, intelligence and working together in the region against what they consider to be common enemies. So I think it's going to be really quite difficult for any of these leaders to be declarative about trade arms deals and the stopping of those. The only nation that has actually done that, as you know, is Germany so far. And apart from the United States, there are other nations here with those arms interests. The UK is an obvious one, and nations all over the world with massive trade interests. The famous Doha in the desert, which took place. So just to say, the famous Doha in the desert, which took place, there was $55 billion worth of trade being discussed there. So I think it's going to be rather difficult for nations around the world to disengage from those relationships they have with Saudi Arabia.
Well, as you said, only the German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced that it's going to stop. It will not approve new arms exports to Saudi Arabia until further notice. Some people are saying this is clear where the moral leadership in the Western world now stands. Dr. Arab, do you think President Trump really worry about that?
Well, similarly, European Parliament today passed a resolution suggesting none of the European Union members should continue engaging in military sales with Saudis. Obviously, this does not necessarily interest Donald Trump, if quite the opposite, if it may actually encourage him to offer further sales to Saudi Arabia. For Donald Trump, at this point in time, the point is not about whether to cancel the arms sales or not, but about the type of partner he would like to shake hands with. And if that's not going to be a Crown Prince, it may as well be someone else. But President Trump will not be willing to let go of that lucrative arms trade deal, as he calls it, because he believes that would create further employment in his own constituency back at home.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because reports have surfaced suggesting that the $110 billion bill is actually hugely exaggerated. The number mostly refers to deals struck during the Obama administration between the U.S. and Saudi, and new deals that haven't yet materialized. And the number of jobs that might be created is also very questionable, swinging from a few 100,000 to 1 million, because President Trump has quoted wildly different numbers. So, Professor Keskin, how much is this an effort to safeguard a more important item on President Trump's scoreboard as we go into the midterm elections?
I think that we need to look at also, not just the Trump administration foreign policy, but we need to look at the, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and United States, the history between these two countries. I mean, current state of the Saudi Arabia was supported and restructured by the United States in the early 1930s, especially relation with the Saudi Aramco oil company from the California. This has a long relationship with the United States beside the arm deal. We need to remember this. And last few years there was a secret war between Saudi Arabia and the United States over the ownership of the Aramco. That we need to remember this. And this deal, from my own perspective, is related with the Khashoggi case, because of the Saudi Arabia or King Salman's hands now is weaker than before. This is a very complicated issue between the United States and Saudi Arabia, but I agree with the other two guests. I don't think anyone can disengage from the Saudi Arabia at this moment because of this incident. International relation, it has more complicated history and realist history than our emotions, basically.
Of course. Well, on the part of Turkey, Turkey has been sparing no efforts in finding out the truth. This is actually what Turkish President Erdogan said. Very quickly, let's listen to that.
Ülke olarak cinayetin üstünün örtülmesine.
We are determined not to allow a cover-up of this murder, and to make sure all those responsible, from those who ordered it to those who carried it out, will not be allowed to avoid justice. This is not only a responsibility to Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered viciously in our country's borders, but also to the international community, law and justice.
Dr. Arab, let me go to you. Is Turkey trying to put maximum pressure on Saudi Arabia? Some people are saying that the Turkish side has lost the story on Khashoggi. What is your take?
I agree the Turkish side lost the story on Khashoggi, but it doesn't mean that President Erdogan would still be able to get certain moderated concessions from the Riyadh administration. Yet, I don't think President Erdogan managed to use that opportunity on his speech at the Turkish parliament on Tuesday, the extent to which he would have liked to use. This may as well be the result of CIA Director Gina Haspel's visit the night before, and I don't know what they talked, but obviously he did not reveal the naked truth as he promised earlier, yet instead chose to ask questions. And at this point, Turkish act of balancing Saudi influence in the Sunni Muslim world obviously is very much contingent upon the extent to which U.S. would allow Turkey coming back into the scene.
Okay. Mr. Chef in Jerusalem, very briefly, if it is proven that the Crown Prince was implicit in any way, what do you think is this going to cost him? 30 seconds, please.
Well, I think, very briefly, there is no clear path to his ouster. He has a remarkable amount of power now in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He controls the Defence Ministry, we shouldn't forget that, and last year took over the Interior Ministry, which means that he has his own commanders in the army. It means that he controls internal security. I haven't heard of any clear path to his ouster from people within the kingdom or outside of the kingdom.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Professor Togro Keskin from the Center of Turkish Studies at Shanghai University, Marcos Chef, CEO of Impaxi, and in Washington, D.C., Dr. Doha Erab from the School of International Service at the American University. You are watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, does the migrant caravan heading towards the Mexico-U.S. border have any hope of achieving their goal of entering the U.S.? Stay with me. A caravan of Central American migrants has swollen to more than 7,000 people, according to the UN, as it heads towards the United States. In response, U.S. President Donald Trump tweeted a familiar call to stop the onslaught of illegal aliens from crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, threatening to cut aid to 3 Central American nations if they let people travel to the U.S. illegally. Since 2014, the U.S. has committed $2.6 billion in aid for Honduras, Guatemala and El Salvador. Now, the 3 countries combined received more than $500 million from the U.S. in fiscal year 2017, according to the AP. Now, the caravan has snowballed as it traveled westward since about 160 migrants departed from the Honduran city of San Pedro Sula, with many people joining spontaneously, carrying just a few belongings. And now there are reports of a new caravan of some 2,500 people forming at the Honduran-Guatemalan border. So what is the likely fate of these refugees? Will we see a repeat of a similar caravan that made its way northwards in April and which eventually petered out in Mexico? Joining me from Cleveland, Ohio is David Leopold, former president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and chair of immigration law at Ulmer and Byrne LLP, and from Washington, D.C., Maria Fernanda Perez, associate director of the Adrian Asht Latin America Center of the Atlantic Council. Welcome to both of you. Maria, let me go to you first. What has been the driving force for so many Hondurans and others to attempt this migration, and why now?
Thank you for the invitation to speak on this topic today. For many decades, Hondurans and other Central Americans from the Northern Triangle have been escaping levels of violence and poverty that are not seen anywhere else in the world. For a region that is not at war, these countries, San Pedro Sula specifically, was called for many years the murder capital of the world. In a country where impunity is so rampant that getting away with murder is not the exception, it's the norm. So these Hondurans are escaping endemic levels of poverty and violence, and they're trekking their way up to the U.S. in hopes of a better future.
Okay. Now, President Trump wants Mexico to stop these refugees from crossing into the U.S. legally. The refugees should apply for asylum in the country where they first land instead of their wished final destination. So, David, in this sense, President Trump seems to be on solid ground, doesn't he?
Well, let's talk about President Trump for just a second, because I can't go on the air this morning without giving a little context. We're sitting here in the United States this morning where we've had a terrorist attack on 2 former presidents, a former First Lady, a former Secretary of State, a former Vice President, a member of Congress, an actor, and we don't know what else is coming. And this is directly related to the ugly rhetoric coming out of the President's mouth. And you have the President who says this caravan, this so-called caravan, is a national emergency. Well, let's talk about what a national emergency really is. In the time that these folks, these mothers, their children, would take to get through Mexico, 16,000 Americans will die from drug overdoses in the United States. That's an emergency. 690,000 Americans, 267,000 of which are children, will be rendered homeless over that same period of time in the United States. 8,800 Americans will die because of gunshots in the United States. That is a national emergency. What we're talking about are people who are desperate from Central America, and they're desperate because the United States, under President Trump, has refused to get to the root causes of the problems which are leading people in desperation to flee places like Honduras, places like Guatemala and El Salvador. This is a problem of the President's own making.
Well,
this so-called caravan. And
yes, still, don't you think, from a common sense point of view, don't you think a president and a country has the kind of interest and the right to secure their borders so that not masses of immigrants can just come in like that?
It's not about respectfully.
Yeah.
David, that's not what's going on, though. Okay, you're repeating rhetoric coming out of the President's mouth. These people are not coming to the United States illegally. In fact, I'm sorry to correct, but
go ahead.
It is absolutely legal to apply. It is absolutely legal under U.S. law, Section 208 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, to apply for asylum in this country, no matter how you got here, if you arrive undocumented, if you arrive at a border checkpoint, however you get here, it is absolutely legal. So for the President to say that these people are coming somehow to do something illegal is another lie coming from the mouth of the President of the United States. We have a President who does not deal in smart policy. He deals in lies, half-truths, falsehoods,
well, he has said that there could very well be Middle Easterners in the caravan, but he also said there is no proof of anything. There is no proof of anything.
Really?
Yeah. So I want to ask maybe Maria this question: do you think it is possible that some of these so-called Middle Easterners could join the caravan and try to cross into the U.S., passing themselves as Latin Americans?
Well, this, what President Trump was tweeting about over the weekend, he heard first from President of Guatemala, Jimmy Morales, who said that he had captured over 100 ISIS fighters in Guatemala. And then they started saying that these people are in the caravan, and that the caravan is so large that you don't really know who is a part of this caravan. Now, President Trump has also kind of walked that back and said that he has no evidence, but that it just might be so that there are Middle Easterners in this caravan. But UN figures say that there are over 7,000 people, mostly composed of women and children, who are, you know, as David was saying, coming into this country looking for a better future.
Okay. President Trump's threats have done little to actually assuage the members of the caravan from trying to reach the U.S. border to make their claims for asylum. Some actually members of the group have become so insistent on staying together. In fact, they're turning down medical aid or offers of bus rides to ensure that they continue as a group. So, David, would you say they have learned some lessons from previous attempts at crossing into the U.S. in such fashion?
The only lesson to be learned here is that we have a president who is dealing in lies and half-truths. I mean, even to discuss on the air at a major television network his completely unfounded claims that they're somehow Middle Easterners or what have you, gives him credibility. Now, in terms of learning a lesson, the only lesson to be learned here is that the United States government, whether it be President Donald Trump or Jefferson Sessions, the Attorney General, or Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, these are the people that are breaking the law. These are the people who are prosecuting folks unnecessarily in an unlawful manner for doing what the law permits them to do. And as far as the folks who are leaving Central America go, you know, this is a long-term problem, but the United States really has to get to the root causes. And the root causes are the fact that there's lack of rule of law in those countries. Women are subjected to horrific domestic violence. There's rampant gang violence. And rather than stand around and tweet meaningless, ugly rhetoric, what we should be doing is getting to those root causes and assisting the Central American people in their home countries. We could be doing things like having regional asylum centers. People can apply more safely in their country or near their country, places like Costa Rica or Mexico. We could be working with those countries to solve
Well,
this
instead,
problem.
President Trump is threatening to close off the border, the entire 2,000-mile U.S. border with Mexico if the caravan doesn't turn back. So, Maria, can he logistically do that? And if he can, what will be the consequences it would have on America's ability to trade and Americans' ability to trade and travel?
Yeah, first, I'd like to say that the complexity of the reality of these Northern Triangle countries is much more complex than 280 characters allows you to write out, to spell out. Logistically, yes, he can seal off the border. Presidents have done this in part in the past. We saw that after 9/11, President Bush closed off part of the southern border. We saw that with President Reagan when a DEA agent was killed in Mexico. He closed off the border. And that serves a purpose of, one, intimidating Mexico or pushing Mexico to cooperate more, do more of what President Trump would like Mexico to do. But Economically, it would be disastrous. Over 1.7 billion of goods and services cross the border every day, so the implications would reverberate all over the country, not just the border states. Okay. Logistically, yes, President Trump could do that, but the consequences would be disastrous.
Well, he also said, he also tweeted that he is bringing out the military for this national emergency. David, is there any legal ground for him to do that?
No, we have a law, posse comitatus law. We're not allowed to use the military for internal policing. Look, when President Trump, let's get back, the man has no credibility. All right? I don't know why we are repeating his lies and his tweets in a discussion. The real root of the problem is that the United States needs to, as I said before, work hard in those Central American countries to assist in developing long-term strategic goals like following the rules of law, fair policing, etc., etc. In terms of our border, and in terms of our border security, why hasn't the United States Congress fixed this broken immigration system? Rather than, you know, yelling and pointing at people and blaming
the Democrats for inspiring laws. Yeah, for inspiring the laws which make it tougher for the U.S. to stop people at the border. I know that's
Which laws specifically are we talking about?
Yeah, well, that's an entirely that's an entirely different discussion.
Well,
David,
let's be clear
David,
here.
I'm not trying to debate with you here. I'm actually doing it for the sake of argument, right? You need to have the other side of the argument for you.
I understand that, but allow me to answer.
Yeah. But
you were legitimately raised a point for the sake of argument. Please allow me to answer. You said it was Democrat laws and so on and so forth.
Unfortunately, we're really running out of time.
The Democratic Senate.
I have to stop it there, David. I have to stop it.
You should give me a chance to answer if you raise the issue.
Next time, okay? I already gave you a lot of time to answer the questions today. Okay, many thanks to my two guests here, David Leopold, former president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and from Washington, D.C., Maria Fernanda Perez, associate director of the Adrian Ash Latin American Center of the Atlantic Council. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.